Welcome to the Bearded Naked podcast, unveiling the 8 limbs of yoga. I'm Gareth Johnson, and this podcast series is a conversation with Matt, the Bearded Naked Yogi. In this 10-episode series, we're delving deep into the core principles of yoga, shedding light on its ancient wisdom and timeless teachings. Matt is taking us through the 8 limbs of yoga, sharing his philosophy and revealing the essence of this ancient practice. Matt, this is episode 6 of the series. What are we covering this time around?
This is episode 6 of the series, and I'm delighted we've made it this far. I hope everyone's enjoying our conversation and the information that's being shared. So, this time around, up to this point, we have discussed the first 4 of the personal examinations, the attitudes and physical practices that any aspirant on the path of yoga would seek to examine and adopt on that journey. With episode 6, we've arrived at the 5th limb of yoga, which is known as Pratyahara or Pratyahara. And it's at this point that the practices move away from the external and become deeply internal and perhaps deeply individual. It's from this point onwards that we may be considered to be entering the true heart of the science of yoga, a deepening contemplation of the behavior of our own minds and our internal landscape. And this is a purposeful contemplation and examination, perhaps with a goal in mind of dropping our ego-driven and false perceptions about ourselves, about the world and the environment in which we live, and culminating in a very pure and clear recognition that we are one and the same, not only with each other, but also with what could be referred to as the divine source. And within that recognition, perhaps we acknowledge that there is no separation in our experience of self and other. And if that all sounds a little bit poetic, if it all sounds a little bit mystical and woo-woo, if you want to call it that, it is with these practices now, the final 4 limbs of yoga. This is what it's all about. It's that inward journey. We have examined our lives, we have examined our attitudes towards ourselves and towards our environment. Our bodies have become nice and strong with lots and lots of asana practice. And we have maximized the levels of breath and prana within the body. But it's here where the real fun begins.
That sounds pretty major, and it also feels like a bit of a shift in gears in terms of the 8 limbs. Let's break it down then. What makes Pratyahara so important?
The literal translation of the word Pratyahara, it means a withdrawal of the senses. It's literally translated as a withdrawal of food. And in this context, that word food, it refers to the external stimuli with which we are bombarded each and every day through those 5 physical senses of the body. And as I said, when an aspiring yogi has reached this point of their journey through the 8 limbs, they have examined the yamas and the niyamas. They have disciplined practice of asana, those beautiful physical postures of yoga. And they have undertaken a journey of mastering control and cultivating the breath and the prana through the exercises of pranayama itself. It is at this point, once again, that disciplined attentiveness towards oneself and towards one's journey begins to turn inwards to a personal space of contemplation, and it is the beginning of a journey in which we train our mind. Now, the mind is a very curious thing. And I could talk about this quite happily for a whole afternoon, but we don't have that amount of time here. But needless to say, when we talk about the mind in yoga, we are talking about that everyday temporal consciousness that we all have, the little voice that's spinning around in our head, with its analysing, its judgments, its comparisons and its projections, all of these things that are thrown onto the experience of life. And these things, the thoughts and the feelings, these judgments and projections, are caused by this external stimuli of what's going on. Mind can be said to be very good at reacting and responding to what it is given, this external stimuli, the food that is offered towards our five senses. But with Pratyahara, we just take that attentiveness inside of ourselves, breath, body, and mind.
In an earlier episode, we were talking about abstinence, and now you're talking about withdrawal of food. Is it as bleak as it sounds? How can we engage with Pratyahara in a practical way that doesn't include skipping meals?
You're not on board with the fasting bit, are you, at all? And I don't blame you. I don't blame you at all. So, when we talk about this withdrawal of the senses and this withdrawal of food, as in the external stimuli of the world, onto the conscious and temporal mind, this is cultivated within these practices of Pratyahara as a withdrawal from, and perhaps with an ultimate aim of a complete removal of all external stimuli that would otherwise seek to distract the aspiring yogi from a necessary internal self-reflection that inevitably, and I'll repeat that, it inevitably leads to a recognition of what is known as the true self. This true self that exists within union and connection with all beings in this world, animate or inanimate, and certainly across the whole cosmos itself. There's that old maxim that's often said that we are all one. Pratyahara can be seen as the beginning of a journey of realization that in fact that maxim is absolutely true. Within the yogic tradition, there are two types of pratyahara that are practiced, and both are intimately connected and support one another in this journey. Those two types of pratyahara, and it's really going to test my pronunciation of Sanskrit here, there is indriya pratyahara and there is prana pratyahara.
Okay, if it's testing your pronunciation, it's definitely going to test mine, but let's try and explore the difference between those two then. Let's start with the first one, Indriya Pratyahara. What's that about?
Beautiful. Well done. Well done. We'll get you there. So this first technique of Pratyahara, Indriya Pratyahara, is a literal withdrawal of sensory inputs into the body, reversing that flow of stimuli. By relatively simple exercises, such as a sustained concentration of the awareness on the flow of one's breathing, a connection with and a reaction to external sensory stimulation is gradually severed. As our awareness within these practices is fully and deeply absorbed, perhaps just within the breath, just within a physical meditative exercise, there is no awareness of anything external to oneself. Remember, we are turning the attentiveness, we are turning our awareness to that internal landscape. Many of the exercises that are associated with Indriya Pratyahara, probably the most famous is a yoga posture known as Shavasana. And this is everyone's favourite pose. It's where you're lying down on the back of the body in a very, very comfortable position. There is no movement involved. One is simply completely in repose upon one's yoga mat. Now, this can sound to be extraordinarily simple, but within that reclined posture of Shavasana, again, attentiveness and awareness is turned inside the body. And that attentiveness, the practice of that internal awareness, requires the cultivation of quite a strong will and an extraordinary amount of focus. That everyday mind, that temporal consciousness I mentioned a few minutes ago, it has the habit of continuously moving from one sensory input to another. Now that is perfectly natural, and that is exactly how that aspect of our consciousness is supposed to work. It is how we make sense of our external environment. However, we recall here that this practice of Pratyahara is not concerned with the external, other than being the method by which the sensory stimuli is gradually reduced. Pratyahara is the beginning of that internal cultivation of awareness and attentiveness. And it does take practice. When one is lying within Shavasana, it's very easy for the mind to think, I must add crumpets to my shopping list, or I've got to remember to do my child's homework, or put the washing on, or something like this. But we become aware of the behavior of the mind. We begin to understand the behavior of the mind, and we just gently bring ourselves back to where we are. Breath, body, awareness.
Thank you for the reminder about the crumpets.
I love a buttered crumpet. Who doesn't love a buttered crumpet?
That's the first type of Pratyahara. What about the second type, which is Prana Pratyahara? What's that all about?
So the second type of Pratyahara, and excellent pronunciation there, Prana Pratyahara, is the control of our senses through the control of our prana. And if people cast their mind back to episode 5, we had a wonderful discussion there upon pranayama as the fourth limb of yoga. And this sense of prana is that all-pervading and all-sustaining energy of life, consciousness, and of the universe itself, and is seen as being the vital fuel for our physical body. Now, when we start to bring that energy of prana under control through the exercises of pranayama and also through the exercises of prana pratyahara, it prevents an unrestricted use in fueling the scattergun approach, if you like, of our senses to that external stimuli. We use that energetic sense of the body in tandem with different exercises to bring that awareness in. The yogi here is cultivating what we can call quite a deep store of this vital energy within the cerebro-spiritual energetic centers of the body, which are more commonly known as the chakras. That's a whole other conversation in itself, and certainly not one to be delved too much into here. If you're interested in finding out, as always, the invitation, go and find out.
Now, as we move through each of the 8 limbs of yoga, they do all seem to be pretty interconnected. Just put Pratyahara into context with what we've discussed in previous episodes of this podcast.
As I hope I've elucidated during this episode, the practice of Pratyahara within the 8 limbs and within the wider tradition of yoga is firmly seen as the beginning of the journey inwards. In previous episodes of this podcast, we've discussed those very externalized limbs of yoga. When one examines one's attitudes towards oneself, there is a series of actions that is undertaken or not in order to perhaps take a course correction, if you like, in terms of how one lives one's life. Perhaps we adopt a healthier diet. Perhaps we examine our attitudes towards how we feel about ourselves, how we conduct ourselves within the world. We've also examined the attitudes that one has towards the external environment. All of this is an action-based, externalized understanding and practice. Certainly with asana practice, the most physical, the most external of the limbs of yoga. Pranayama itself, it is concerned with control of something. Your breath, you are very intimately connected with that. So we look at the first of the 4 limbs of yoga. They are external practices. When we have mastered, and I'll put inverted comments around that because no one's ever really been able to tell me what mastery of any of that is. we arrive here at Pratyahara, and once again, it's the beginning of the journey inwards. That journey with an intention and a goal of reaching a, let's say, high level of self-awareness and a real recognition of our inherent connection, not just with ourselves, but with other people and with the world and environment in which we live. Now, I would probably say, and certainly in my experience as a student of yoga and as a teacher of yoga, many people who embark upon the journey of yoga would never get past pranayama, the previous limb. Everyone loves to do the asana practice. It feels wonderful, and that's why we do it. Everyone loves the breathing exercises, and again, as we discussed previously, incredible benefits for the body, and certainly around the levels of stress that we all feel within this modern age. There's an examination of one's relationships. Perhaps one chooses to become a vegetarian. Perhaps one chooses to undertake long periods of fasting without any food. And I'm looking at you. You know, that's often as far as people would get. When we start here, and these remaining 4 limbs of yoga, that journey becomes internal. There is the responsibility upon the yogi to begin examining their own mind, their own consciousness, and all those thoughts and all those feelings, all those little things that perhaps we may not want to shine a little bit of light on. There is no choice at this point but to shine the light of awareness upon yourself. I've certainly seen it in some classes. One of the things that's very often said to me is, I cannot meditate. I cannot practice shavasana. I'm always fidgeting. My mind is always thinking. I don't like the thoughts that come up into my mind. Well, examine them. That's the point. Don't push them down. Don't repress them. Do not suppress them. Examine your own thoughts. Examine why you feel the way that you feel about your own thoughts. This is the most important and beautiful journey that anyone will undertake on the path of yoga.
That brings us to the end of episode 6 of the Bearded Naked podcast, unveiling the 8 limbs of yoga. I'm Gareth Johnson. You can find me on Twitter at GTP London. If you want to get in touch with Matt or find out more about his online courses and retreats, head over to his website, thebeardednakedyogi.com.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening, and we shall look forward to seeing you in episode 7. Namaste, and look after yourselves.